Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe, where we guide you through complex international issues using clear and careful English. And today, we begin with a topic that is shaping global conversations, influencing economic predictions, and raising important questions about how power is shifting across our world in ways that matter to every learner who wants to understand modern geopolitics.
This episode opens with one of the most discussed questions in international analysis, because many experts, students, and curious listeners want to know whether the BRICS group, a coalition of major emerging economies, represents a genuine long-term challenge to the global influence held by the United States. And understanding this subject helps learners follow world news with greater clarity and confidence.
The reason this topic is important is that discussions about BRICS and American global leadership do not only involve political decisions, but also include economics, trade networks, financial cooperation, population growth, technological development, and the future balance of global partnerships, which makes this a perfect learning opportunity for anyone who wants to build strong English skills through meaningful content.
Before we continue, dear listeners, we kindly ask you to support our educational work by liking this video, because your engagement helps us reach more learners, encourages us to create deeper global topic lessons, and allows us to keep producing long, slow, and clear podcasts designed specifically to improve your listening ability through real-world subjects that spark thoughtful discussion.
We also invite you to subscribe to the English Globe, since subscribing ensures that you never miss an important episode, a new global topic, or a language lesson that explains international events in simple, structured, and learner-friendly English, making it easier for you to follow world developments and build vocabulary connected to politics, economics, and global cooperation.
And finally, dear listeners, please tell us in the comments where you are listening from and share your thoughts on today's question, because your participation helps us understand our wonderful global community, encourages other learners to interact, and creates a space where students from different countries can exchange ideas, develop confidence, and practice expressing opinions in clear English.
When we talk about a country having global dominance, we are not speaking about control or force, but rather about the ability to shape international decisions, influence global markets, guide economic rules, and inspire cultural trends. And this kind of influence usually grows from strong economic performance, technological leadership, trusted institutions, and long-term partnerships with other nations that depend on stability and cooperation.
For English learners, the word dominance can sound heavy or aggressive, but in global studies, it often refers to which country has the strongest ability to set standards, create financial networks, make innovations, and attract support from partners who rely on the stability, credibility, and long experience that a powerful nation can offer, especially when it maintains consistent relationships across regions and industries.
When we examine the United States, we see that its influence grew over many decades through advanced technology, large universities, cultural exports, strong financial systems, and a network of alliances that support trade, communication, and security. And these factors help the country play a major role in how decisions are made across different regions, industries, and international organizations.
However, global influence is never fixed, because economic growth, population expansion, innovation, and new cooperation among countries can slowly shift the balance. And this is where BRICS becomes interesting, since the group brings together large economies with different strengths, giving them a combined weight that attracts attention from analysts who study how global power may evolve in the next few decades.
For example, when several countries unite their resources, share economic goals, coordinate development strategies, and collaborate on financial decisions, they create a kind of collective voice that may shape how trade agreements are formed, how investments move across borders, and how international systems adjust to meet the needs of regions that want greater representation in global decision-making.
Understanding these ideas helps English learners follow international news more easily because words like influence, alliances, strategic partnerships, economic blocs, and power balance appear very often in global discussions, and learning them through a clear explanation allows listeners to understand not only the vocabulary, but also the deeper meaning behind why countries cooperate or compete on the world stage.
This deeper understanding also helps learners make sense of why many nations join groups like BRICS, since such alliances can give them a platform to express their development needs, build stronger economies, and negotiate more effectively in a world where large markets and powerful institutions often shape opportunities, policies, and economic directions that smaller countries must respond to carefully.
By exploring these concepts slowly and clearly, we aim to give all listeners the tools they need to understand global power in simple terms. Because when you break these ideas down, they are not about conflict, but about connections, influence, shared goals, and long-term strategies that countries use to improve their futures, protect their interests, and participate in a changing global environment.
When we explore the origins of BRICS, we must travel back to the early 2000s, a period when global economics was changing rapidly, and many countries outside the Western world were beginning to grow at impressive speeds, leading analysts to question whether the international financial system truly represented the interests, strengths, and future expectations of rising nations that had long been viewed as secondary players in global decision-making.
For English learners, it is helpful to understand the term emerging economies, which describes countries that are developing quickly, expanding their industries, increasing their incomes, and gaining greater visibility in international markets, which means they are transitioning from lower levels of development towards stronger positions where they can influence trade, investment, and global cooperation.
The idea of BRICS first appeared in 2001 when a researcher named Jim O'Neill, working at a major global investment company, wrote a study suggesting that Brazil, Russia, India, and China were becoming so economically important that they would shape the future of global growth, and his argument was that these four nations had large populations, strong potential, and rising markets that deserved more recognition.
This is where the word cooperation becomes important for learners, because cooperation means working together for shared benefits. And in the case of BRICS, these countries realized that by combining their economic strengths, they could speak with a louder collective voice in global institutions, gain more influence in worldwide discussions, and support each other's development in ways that individual countries could not achieve alone.
At the time, Brazil was becoming a major agricultural and industrial power. Russia was rich in energy resources. India was developing a massive technology and service sector, and China was already transforming into the world's manufacturing center. And when analysts looked at these strengths together, they saw a group of nations whose combined economic power could shape the 21st century in meaningful ways.
Another important expression for English learners is shared goals, which refers to objectives or ambitions that several groups or countries have in common. And the BRICS nations shared goals such as improving their global influence, increasing trade among themselves, supporting national development, and gaining a stronger voice in financial organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank.
In 2006, the idea of BRICS moved from theory to reality when foreign ministers from Brazil, Russia, India, and China met on the sidelines of a United Nations meeting. And during their conversations, they realized that working together could help them promote economic cooperation, discuss global challenges, and advocate for reforms that would give emerging countries more representation in international decision-making structures.
The word development is crucial here, because each of these nations wanted to accelerate development in different ways, whether it was through infrastructure, education, investment, or technology, and by forming a cooperative group, they believed they could support each other and create a network of resources that would help reduce obstacles that often slow progress in rapidly growing economies.
In 2009, the first official BRICS summit was held in Russia, marking the moment when the group became recognized as a formal partnership rather than a simple idea. And during this meeting, leaders discussed how global financial systems were changing after the 2008 economic crisis, which had caused many emerging countries to question whether existing structures served the needs of the entire world or only a small group of wealthy nations.
For learners, another important vocabulary phrase is economic bloc, which refers to a group of countries that work together to improve trade, coordinate policies, and create economic strength through unity. And BRICS quickly became seen as an economic bloc that aimed not to replace existing powers, but to provide a platform where rising nations could present their perspectives more effectively.
In 2010, South Africa joined the group after being invited by the other members, and its inclusion was significant because it provided representation for the African continent, which brought new diversity, new economic potential, and a broader shared vision into the group. And with this addition, the acronym changed from BRIC to BRICS, marking a more globally inclusive partnership with expanded influence.
The BRICS nations believed that by joining together, they could support a more balanced global order, encourage investments among their members, share development strategies, promote cooperation in technology and education, and provide alternatives for countries seeking partnerships that were not traditionally available through Western-led institutions.
Another key reason these countries formed BRICS was their desire to diversify global leadership, meaning they wanted a world where many countries could guide decisions rather than one or two dominant powers. And this belief was based on the idea that global systems become more effective and more stable when multiple voices participate in shaping the economic and political direction of international policies.
For English learners, it is useful to understand the phrase multipolar world, which describes a world where several major powers exist rather than one central authority. And BRICS supported this idea because they believed a multipolar world would create more opportunities, reduce dependence on a single power, and allow emerging nations to contribute more actively to global discussions.
The BRICS nations also recognized that their individual strengths could complement each other, since Brazil had agricultural power, Russia controlled massive energy supplies, India offered technological skill and a young workforce, China provided industrial capacity, and South Africa contributed mineral wealth and regional influence, creating a combination of resources that could support growth across continents.
Understanding how different strengths work together helps learners see why cooperation between countries can be so powerful, because when nations combine their abilities, they can build projects in infrastructure, energy, technology, and development that would be far more difficult to achieve alone. And this is one reason BRICS became a symbol of shared ambition among rising economies.
At the heart of the BRICS partnership is the belief that countries with large populations and growing economies deserve a stronger role in shaping global financial rules, trade systems, and development models, and by forming a united group, these nations aim to ensure that their interests would not be overlooked in discussions that affect billions of people across multiple regions of the world.
Today, as BRICS continues to grow and attract interest from additional countries, it is important for learners to understand its history, because the origins of the group reveal how global power shifts, how emerging economies respond to long-term challenges, and how cooperation can help nations strengthen themselves by building alliances based on shared experiences, shared goals, and shared visions for the future.
When we look at BRICS today, we see an alliance that has changed significantly from its early days because the original 5-member structure has expanded into a larger and more diverse group, as several countries from the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and Latin America have shown strong interest in joining. And this growing attention reflects a desire among emerging economies to participate in a broader network that offers economic cooperation, development opportunities, and a sense of collective strength.
To help English learners understand this development, it is important to recognize that international groups usually evolve over time, and BRICS has become attractive to new nations because it presents a political space where countries feel they can express their perspectives more freely, participate in high-level discussions without feeling overshadowed, and build relationships that allow them to share concerns related to global representation, governance, and long-term stability.
In economic terms, many of the new applicants are motivated by the potential benefits of increased trade, greater access to investment, and the possibility of collaborating on shared development projects. And these countries see BRICS as a platform that encourages economic growth through partnerships based on mutual respect rather than dependency, which is especially appealing to nations seeking alternatives to traditional financial systems that may not always meet their long-term needs.
From a political perspective, countries interested in BRICS expansion often speak about wanting more autonomy in their international decisions, meaning they prefer to balance their relationships across different global powers instead of relying too heavily on a single partner. And by joining BRICS, they hope to gain a voice in shaping political discussions that affect their regions, including issues such as representation, global governance, and strategic cooperation across continents.
Economically, BRICS offers a number of practical tools that attract new members, such as the New Development Bank, which was created to support infrastructure, energy, and development projects in member countries, and many nations wish to join because they see this bank as a more flexible source of funding, one that focuses on practical development rather than complicated conditions, helping them achieve long-term goals in transportation, energy production, and technological modernization.
Politically, the appeal of BRICS also comes from the idea of creating a world that is more inclusive, where leadership is shared across different regions instead of being concentrated among a few established powers. And this concept encourages emerging nations to participate more actively in global discussions, build diplomatic ties with other members, and express their national interests in a space where political diversity is respected and understood.
For many countries seeking membership, the economic ambition is to strengthen their domestic industries by connecting with large markets such as China, India, and Brazil, because these connections open paths to new exports, greater foreign investment, and improved opportunities for technological cooperation, all of which help them build stronger economies that support job creation, innovation, and sustainable growth across different sectors.
On the political side, these nations see BRICS as a forum where they can discuss international challenges without feeling pressure to choose sides in global rivalries, allowing them to maintain balanced diplomatic relationships while exploring partnerships that support their development, stability, and long-term national strategies, which is particularly important for countries navigating complex political environments.
The ambitions of BRICS today also include the idea of strengthening regional development by encouraging members to work more closely with their neighbors. Because when a country joins a group with broad influence, it often becomes a bridge for economic cooperation, helping surrounding nations gain access to new opportunities in trade, finance, and investment, which ultimately contributes to greater regional stability and growth.
Politically, the expansion of BRICS represents an effort to shape a more cooperative world where nations share responsibility for addressing global issues such as inequality, climate challenges, and technological change, and this shared approach helps member countries feel that their voices matter, their perspectives are valued, and their political priorities can be discussed openly with partners who face similar challenges in development and governance.
Economically, one of the strongest motivations behind joining BRICS is the belief that a larger group with diverse resources can create greater economic resilience, meaning that members can support each other during financial difficulties, diversify their trade relationships, and build more secure supply chains that protect them from global market disruptions, which makes BRICS appealing to countries seeking long-term stability in an unpredictable world economy.
Politically, new members appreciate that BRICS allows them to participate in international discussions without being limited by their size, wealth, or historical influence, because within this group, the focus is on shared goals rather than hierarchy, enabling smaller or developing countries to build partnerships with nations that understand their situations, respect their political independence, and support their efforts to create sustainable futures.
These economic and political motivations explain why BRICS continues to attract interest from nations across multiple continents. As more countries begin to view the alliance not only as an economic bloc, but also as a global platform that represents a new model of cooperation, one that values diversity, encourages collective ambition, and promotes development that is shaped by the needs and experiences of emerging economies, rather than the assumptions of long-established powers.
For English learners, understanding this expansion helps make sense of international news, because terms like multilateral cooperation, development partnerships, economic integration, and political alignment appear frequently in discussions about BRICS, and learning them through clear explanations allows listeners to understand why so many countries want to join a group that promises new opportunities, shared goals, and a more balanced global environment.
When we try to understand the U.S. perspective, it is important to remember that the United States has played a major role in global trade, finance, and international leadership for many decades. And because of this long history, any large economic group that grows in size or influence naturally raises questions among some Americans, who wonder how new partnerships like BRICS might shape future competition, cooperation, and shared responsibilities around the world.
For English learners, this is a good moment to explore the word competition, which simply means different groups working to achieve similar goals. And in global discussions, competition does not always mean conflict, because it can also involve nations striving to build better economies, stronger partnerships, and improved futures, while still maintaining peaceful relationships and participating in international cooperation that benefits everyone involved.
Many people in the United States follow global competition closely because the U.S. economy is highly connected to world markets, meaning that events in other regions can influence American trade, jobs, and industries. And when groups like BRICS grow stronger, some Americans begin to wonder how this might affect long-term economic leadership, technological development, and the ability of the U.S. to guide major international discussions about finance and global policy.
Another useful term is global influence, which refers to a country's ability to shape important decisions in international organizations. And some Americans feel uncertain when new groups begin gaining influence, not because they oppose cooperation, but because they want to understand how responsibilities will be shared, how decisions will be made, and how different economic centers will work together in a balanced and stable way to prevent misunderstandings or economic tension.
From an economic viewpoint, the U.S. often evaluates rising groups by examining their combined trade power, financial capacity, population size, and long-term growth potential. And when BRICS expands or deepens its cooperation, analysts in the United States study these changes carefully to determine whether global markets might shift in ways that require the U.S. to adjust its strategies, strengthen certain industries, or expand partnerships with other regions.
For learners, the word cooperation is essential, because cooperation means working together to achieve shared goals. And even though competition exists in global economics, the United States still cooperates with many BRICS countries on trade, technology, climate issues, and education, demonstrating that global relationships are often complex, with competition and cooperation happening at the same time, depending on the topic and circumstances.
Some Americans feel concerned because the United States has held significant influence in organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other institutions that guide global financial rules. And when BRICS members talk about reform or change, people in the U.S. sometimes see these conversations as signals that international leadership might become more distributed. encouraging a world where several large groups share authority rather than relying on one central leader.
To explain this neutrally, it helps to introduce the phrase shared leadership, which means that decisions are made by several major powers instead of just one. And this idea is not necessarily negative or positive. It simply reflects the reality that global economics is becoming more diverse, and many countries wish to participate more actively in shaping international policies, which leads to new forms of cooperation, new partnerships, and new conversations.
Economically, some Americans also worry about long-term competitiveness, because when emerging groups develop their industries, expand their trade networks, or create development banks, they may attract investments that previously flowed through U.S.-based institutions, and although this does not automatically reduce American influence, it encourages policymakers to remain attentive and adapt to global changes so that the U.S. economy remains strong and innovative.
Another helpful term is global trade, which refers to the exchange of goods and services between countries. And trade is an area where the United States and BRICS nations interact heavily because each side exports products the other needs, meaning that while some Americans feel cautious about BRICS expansion, others view it as an opportunity for new markets, business partnerships, and cultural understanding that can build constructive relationships.
Many American economists emphasize that international competition can also be healthy, because when strong economic groups exist around the world, they encourage innovation, reduce overdependence on one single center of production, and create a more balanced global economy where responsibility is shared. And in this way, BRICS is not always seen as a threat, but rather as a signal that global development is becoming broader and more inclusive.
Some Americans, however, feel uncertain because change often creates questions, and when they see new alliances forming, they want reassurance that global systems will remain stable, predictable, and peaceful, which is why political leaders and analysts spend time studying BRICS developments, explaining them to the public, and encouraging cooperation so that countries can manage differences constructively without creating tension or misunderstanding.
Another element of the U.S. perspective involves strategic planning, because when groups like BRICS grow, the United States carefully reviews how these changes might influence technology, energy, agriculture, manufacturing, and regional security, and this analysis helps American decision-makers understand where collaboration is possible, where competition is likely, and how the U.S. can continue contributing to constructive global leadership.
To support learners, it is important to emphasize that political concerns do not always reflect hostility. They simply show that many Americans care about maintaining stability, strong partnerships, and open communication with other nations, including BRICS members. And this desire for stability encourages discussions about fairness, cooperation, and peaceful development, rather than confrontational language that could increase global tension.
In summary, the U.S. perspective is shaped by a long history of global leadership, a deep connection to international markets, and a desire to maintain economic strength during changing times. And while some Americans express concern about the rise of BRICS, others see it as part of a naturally evolving world where different regions grow, cooperate, and contribute to global progress.
For English learners, understanding these viewpoints is valuable because it shows how countries interpret international developments differently, and by learning words such as competition, cooperation, influence, and shared leadership, listeners can better understand global discussions and form their own informed opinions about how nations work together in an increasingly interconnected world.
When we look at the question of whether BRICS has enough strength to compete with the United States, we must think about several connected factors, because economic influence is not only measured by money, but also by population size, trade networks, technological development, natural resources, and the ability of countries to coordinate their policies in a stable and cooperative way across many different global markets.
To help our listeners understand this topic more easily, we can introduce the term economic bloc, which means a group of countries that work together to improve trade, investment, and development. And BRICS can be seen as an economic bloc that tries to increase cooperation among its members so they can achieve goals that might be more difficult to reach when each country acts alone.
One of the strongest advantages of BRICS is its large population base, because together these countries represent a significant share of the world's people, and a large population can create powerful economic potential by providing a big labor force, a growing consumer market, and opportunities for innovation, manufacturing, and long-term development that help shape global economic trends.
Another useful term for our learners is combined GDP, which means the total value of all goods and services produced by the countries when their economies are added together. And many analysts note that when the combined GDP of BRICS is observed, it shows increasing economic activity that could give the group a stronger voice in discussions about global finance and long-term economic planning.
However, population and GDP alone do not decide global power, because competition at the international level also involves technology, research capacity, advanced industries, and the ability to set global standards. And the United States continues to have strong positions in many of these areas, including digital innovation, scientific discovery, and high-level technological development.
This is why the idea of strategic markets is important, because strategic markets are sectors of the economy that influence global progress, such as energy, technology, transportation, agriculture, and finance. And when we compare the United States and BRICS in these areas, we see that each side has strengths, with BRICS rich in natural resources and population, while the United States is strong in high-tech industries.
When we study natural resources, BRICS nations hold considerable supplies of oil, gas, minerals, and agricultural land, and these resources give the group valuable economic opportunities, because countries that control energy and essential materials often play key roles in global supply chains, allowing them to negotiate more confidently in international markets.
Yet it is also important for learners to understand that resources do not automatically produce global leadership, because leadership at the international level requires stability, investment, infrastructure, and consistent cooperation among member states. And one challenge for BRICS has always been that its members have different political systems, economic priorities, and long-term goals that sometimes make coordination more complex.
Still, it would not be accurate to underestimate BRICS, because the group continues to grow, expand its institutions, create development banks, explore new financial systems, and build trade partnerships that connect regions across Asia, South America, Africa, and the Middle East, which means their influence is increasing even if they are not directly competing with the United States in every category.
For English learners listening today, it is helpful to remember that global influence is not a simple competition with one winner and one loser, but rather a system where many countries participate, negotiate, and collaborate to protect their interests. And when we study BRICS and the United States together, we see a world where cooperation and competition happen at the same time in different areas of the global economy.
When we explore the strengths of BRICS, it is also important to study the internal challenges that limit the group's ability to act as a fully united organization, because these countries have very different political systems, unique national interests, and unequal levels of economic development, which sometimes make it difficult for them to agree on long-term plans or create shared policies that benefit every member in the same way.
For our English learners, we can explain this idea with the term unequal growth, which means that some countries in the group grow quickly while others grow more slowly, and when growth is unequal, it becomes harder for the members to make decisions together, because each country has its own priorities, its own economic situation, and its own expectations about what cooperation should produce in the future.
Another challenge is the wide difference in political systems, because BRICS includes democracies, mixed systems, and centralized governments, And these differences influence how decisions are made, how policies are created, and how quickly each country can respond to international events, making coordination more complex when the group must choose a shared position on major global issues.
To make this easier to understand, we can use a simple example, such as a group project where each student works in a different style, because if one student wants to move quickly and another wants to move slowly, while a third wants to change the plan completely, the group will spend more time discussing than acting, and this is similar to how BRICS sometimes struggles to move as a single unit.
Disagreements also appear when members compete for regional influence, because countries with strong economies or large populations often want to shape policies in ways that support their own interests, and when two or more members have overlapping goals, they may find it difficult to compromise, which can delay decisions or reduce the effectiveness of group projects.
This is why the vocabulary term shared goals is important, because shared goals are necessary for smooth cooperation. And when goals become different from one country to another, coordination becomes more challenging, especially in a group as diverse as BRICS, where each member has its own history, its own regional responsibilities, and its own vision for the future.
Another point that analysts often discuss is that BRICS does not have a unified financial system, a common currency, or a fully integrated trade structure, and without these strong institutional tools, it becomes more difficult for the group to compete with large established economic systems, because stable institutions help countries work together more effectively and build long-term partnerships.
For learners, it may help to think of an institution as a framework or structure that guides cooperation, much like rules in a classroom. And when a group does not have strong institutions, every activity becomes harder to organize, every plan takes longer to complete, and every disagreement becomes more difficult to solve. And this is one reason why BRICS continues to develop new organizations slowly.
Despite these weaknesses, it is important to note that BRICS continues to grow and attract interest from other countries, which means the group still has influence. But analysts agree that if BRICS wants to become stronger, it must create more stability, reduce internal disagreements, and find ways to coordinate its policies more effectively across different regions and economic sectors.
For now, BRICS remains a significant group with great potential, but also many internal challenges. And understanding these challenges helps English learners see that global cooperation is never simple, because countries must balance national interests, economic realities, and long-term strategies, which makes international partnerships complex, but also very interesting to study.
When we think about the future relationship between BRICS and the United States, we must understand that global politics is rarely a simple story of one side winning and the other side losing, because countries often find themselves cooperating in some areas, competing in others, and sharing responsibilities in situations where stability, development, and economic progress benefit everyone involved.
For English learners, it is helpful to imagine the global system as a large network where countries are connected by trade, technology, transportation, and communication. And even when nations have different goals or strategies, they still depend on each other for resources, markets, innovation, and security, which means it is very common to see cooperation and competition happening at the same time.
One possible future is increased cooperation, because both BRICS and the United States share interests in global development, sustainable energy, stable trade routes, and financial stability. And when countries work together on common challenges, they can reduce economic risks, support scientific progress, and create solutions that no single nation could manage alone in a rapidly changing world.
Another possible future is peaceful competition, which is a type of rivalry where countries try to improve their economic strength, technology, and global partnerships without causing conflict. And this kind of competition can actually be helpful for the world, because it pushes nations to innovate, modernize their systems, and provide better opportunities for their populations in a healthy and stable environment.
Many analysts believe the future may include a mixture of both cooperation and competition, because the United States remains a strong global leader with advanced industries and powerful institutions, while BRICS continues to grow in population, resources, and economic activity. And these two forces can shape global development together if they manage their differences with stability and careful dialogue.
For vocabulary learning, the phrase shared global responsibilities is very important because it describes situations where countries must work together on issues like climate, energy, public health, technology standards, and economic fairness. And these responsibilities encourage nations to communicate, coordinate policies, and support peaceful solutions that help maintain global balance.
This balanced future also requires trust and transparency, because cooperation works best when countries share information, follow consistent rules, and build institutions that encourage fairness. And while differences will always exist, many leaders and experts believe that long-term peace and stability come from dialogue, negotiation, and partnerships that respect the interests of all sides.
For English learners, it is essential to understand that global relationships do not behave like simple stories, because the world is too interconnected for clear divisions, and many countries, including BRICS members and the United States, often make decisions based on economic needs, technological goals, or regional challenges, rather than strict rivalry or firm cooperation.
This is why studying global issues helps students become more thoughtful and informed listeners, because once you understand how countries balance competition and cooperation, it becomes easier to follow international news, understand economic developments, and recognize that most global discussions involve complexity rather than simple answers or one-direction movements.
In the end, the future will likely involve countries working together where cooperation brings benefits, competing respectfully where goals differ, and sharing responsibilities where global stability requires unity. And this balanced understanding allows learners to appreciate the rich, interconnected nature of our world while strengthening their English through clear and thoughtful listening. Today, we will focus on some key vocabulary that appeared throughout our discussion on BRICS and global dynamics, because learning these words helps you understand international news more easily, and when you listen carefully, you will notice how these terms describe concepts that appear again and again in discussions about countries, economies, alliances, and global influence in simple and clear ways.
The first word is influence, which refers to the ability of a country or group to affect decisions, policies, or events in other countries. And for example, the United States has influence in global finance, technology, and trade, because many nations follow its decisions and strategies when planning their own economic policies.
Next, we have the word alliance, which describes a partnership between countries that work together for common goals. And in our episode, BRICS can be seen as an alliance because its members cooperate on economic development, trade agreements, and shared global objectives, while still maintaining their individual national policies.
The term emerging market is very important because it describes countries that are growing quickly in industry, technology, and trade. And for instance, India and Brazil are considered emerging markets because their economies are expanding, their industries are modernizing, and investors around the world are increasingly interested in participating in their growth.
Another phrase is power balance, which refers to the distribution of influence and strength among countries. And understanding power balance helps English learners know why the rise of BRICS can change how countries negotiate trade, invest in infrastructure, and participate in global decision-making without necessarily creating conflict.
Finally, we have global system, which describes the overall network of relationships, rules, and institutions that connect countries economically, politically, and socially. And for example, the global system includes organizations like the United Nations, the World Bank, and international trade agreements that guide how countries work together and solve worldwide challenges.
For English learners, it is helpful to use these words in short, simple sentences because repetition and context make it easier to remember. And when you practice using these terms while reading news articles, listening to international updates, or discussing world events, your understanding of global topics and your confidence in English will grow steadily over time.
You can also combine words to describe real situations. For example, BRICS is an alliance of emerging markets that seeks to increase its influence in the global system. Or, the power balance in international trade shifts when large countries work together to create agreements and partnerships that benefit multiple regions.
By learning and practicing these key terms, listeners can follow news about BRICS, global trade, and international relations more easily, and this vocabulary will allow you to read, listen, and speak about world events with greater confidence, helping you understand both the meaning of complex topics and the language used to explain them clearly.
Remember, the best way to internalize these words is to repeat them, write your own sentences, and pay attention when similar words appear in articles, podcasts, or videos, because understanding vocabulary in context makes it easier to recognize patterns, compare ideas, and use English effectively in discussions about international news and global developments.
This concludes our language learning segment, and we encourage listeners to try creating their own examples using today's words, because active practice not only improves vocabulary, but also strengthens comprehension of global concepts, enabling learners to confidently engage with international topics while improving their English step by step.
As we continue to reflect on what we learned today about BRICS, global influence, cooperation, and economic power, it becomes clear that one of the most practical lessons for English learners is that following international news is not only a way to understand global events, but also a powerful method to improve English listening, comprehension, and vocabulary skills. Because when learners connect language to real-world topics, the meaning of words becomes clearer, and long-term retention improves as the mind links abstract concepts with real situations.
For English learners, it is very effective to treat each news story, podcast, or article as a learning opportunity, because by identifying new words like alliance, emerging markets, power balance, or global system, you begin to see patterns in vocabulary and sentence structures that are commonly used in educational and journalistic contexts, which helps you recognize these terms when they appear again in future readings, podcasts, or conversations, and this repeated exposure strengthens both comprehension and retention.
Another practical strategy is to pause while listening to a podcast or news clip and write down key phrases or sentences that are new or challenging, because actively noting vocabulary helps learners focus on pronunciation, word meaning, and sentence structure, and when you later review these notes, you can rewrite them in your own words or use them in your own sentences, reinforcing both understanding and confidence in speaking English about complex topics like international relations, trade, and global cooperation.
It is also important to practice summarizing information in simple sentences, because when learners take a paragraph, podcast segment, or news article and explain it in their own words, they are practicing comprehension, critical thinking, and English sentence construction at the same time, and summarizing teaches students to identify the most important points, focus on vocabulary that matters, and organize ideas logically without becoming overwhelmed by complicated language or unfamiliar grammar patterns.
Another helpful approach is to use vocabulary in context. For example, after hearing words like influence or emerging market, learners can create their own sentences such as, China has strong influence in global trade because of its population and economic growth, or India is an emerging market that attracts investors from many countries. By using these words in meaningful sentences, learners improve their ability to recall vocabulary, understand nuances of meaning, and gain confidence in expressing ideas about global topics.
English learners can also benefit from paying attention to the way sentences are structured in podcasts or news articles, because noticing how speakers use linking words like because, however, while, and therefore helps learners connect ideas smoothly, explain relationships between causes and effects, and describe events in a logical sequence, which is particularly useful when discussing complex subjects such as international alliances, economic competition, or shared global responsibilities.
Listening regularly to topics like BRICS and international cooperation also exposes learners to different accents, pacing, and pronunciation, which helps train the ear to recognize English words in natural speech, because every news source, podcast, or interview presents a slightly different way of speaking, and over time, repeated exposure improves not only comprehension, but also confidence in both listening and speaking English in real-world situations, whether in conversations, classrooms, or professional settings.
For comprehension practice, learners can ask themselves reflective questions about the content, such as, why do countries form alliances? Or, what is the difference between cooperation and competition? By pausing to answer these questions, either in writing or aloud, learners reinforce their understanding, practice using vocabulary in context, and develop critical thinking skills that will help them follow international discussions with greater ease and clarity.
Another useful exercise is to create mini dictionaries of terms used in global news. For example, write down strategic market, shared leadership, combined GDP or global system, and then next to each word or phrase, write a simple definition, a sentence from a podcast, and your own sentence using the term. This method helps learners consolidate new vocabulary while also practicing grammar, sentence formation, and contextual understanding, all of which are essential for following advanced topics.
A further technique is to compare different sources reporting on the same event, such as a new BRICS development or an international trade decision, because noticing differences in wording, vocabulary, or sentence structure provides insight into how language is used to explain facts, opinions, or analysis. This practice improves reading comprehension, critical thinking, and English vocabulary, while allowing learners to see how complex ideas are communicated clearly and accurately to different audiences.
Learners can also benefit from recording themselves summarizing a news story or podcast segment, because when you listen to your own voice, you can notice pronunciation errors, sentence flow, and clarity of expression. This self-review method strengthens both listening and speaking skills and helps learners gain confidence in using English to discuss topics like global trade, alliances, and economic competition, which are increasingly relevant in today's interconnected world.
For English learners, it is helpful to create simple examples linking vocabulary to personal experience. For example, my country could join an emerging market alliance to improve trade, or I can understand global influence by reading news about international meetings. By connecting words to real-life experiences, learners make abstract concepts more concrete, which improves retention, comprehension, and the ability to use English actively in meaningful conversations.
It is also important to remember that learning English through global topics builds both language skills and world knowledge at the same time, because by following international news, studying alliances like BRICS, or listening to discussions about cooperation and competition, learners strengthen vocabulary, develop comprehension, and gain insight into how countries make decisions, interact, and manage global challenges, giving them tools to engage in informed discussions about current events.
One final recommendation for learners is consistency. Regularly listening to podcasts, reading short news articles, and practicing vocabulary for even 15 to 20 minutes a day will lead to steady improvement, because English is best learned through repeated exposure, active use, and practical application. And global topics provide a rich, meaningful, and exciting context to practice listening, reading, writing, and speaking skills simultaneously.
In conclusion, learners can apply today's lessons immediately by reviewing the vocabulary we discussed, summarizing key points from this podcast, and reflecting on global news stories while practicing English in short, manageable segments. This approach connects language learning to real-world knowledge, reinforces comprehension, and strengthens confidence in using English to discuss complex topics with clarity and accuracy.
Remember that learning English is a journey, and exploring international topics such as BRICS, global trade, alliances and influence allows learners to improve both language skills and understanding of the world. Every small step, such as learning a new word, forming a sentence, or summarizing an idea, moves you closer to fluency and deeper comprehension, making English practice meaningful, practical, and enjoyable every day.
Keep listening, stay curious, and apply what you learn from global news to your English studies, because consistent exposure to vocabulary, sentence structures, and ideas from real-world contexts strengthens comprehension, speaking, and confidence, while also providing a richer understanding of the interconnected world we live in today.
Finally, remember that your progress depends on patience, practice, and curiosity. By combining English learning with global awareness, you gain both language skills and critical thinking abilities, enabling you to follow news, engage in discussions, and communicate confidently, which makes every podcast, article, and conversation a valuable step toward fluency and a deeper understanding of the world.
As we finish today's episode, it is useful to summarize the key educational points for English learners, because understanding global groups like BRICS involves economic, political, and social concepts. And by following our discussion, listeners have learned new vocabulary such as influence, alliance, emerging markets, power balance, and global system, while also exploring how cooperation and competition shape relationships between countries.
To help listeners check their understanding, we will now do a short comprehension activity, because answering simple questions helps improve both vocabulary and listening skills. And you can pause the podcast and think about your answers before we discuss them together, which will make your English practice more active and meaningful.
First, consider the question: why do some countries join groups like BRICS? Think about what benefits countries may gain, such as economic growth, shared development, stronger trade partnerships, or a voice in international decisions, because each country has unique interests that guide its participation in alliances and international organizations.
Next, reflect on the question: what does global influence mean? Global influence refers to a country's ability to shape decisions, policies, and outcomes that affect other nations. And when you understand this concept, you can see why large groups like BRICS or strong countries like the United States are often central in discussions about trade, finance, and international cooperation.
Another idea to consider is how cooperation and competition often happen at the same time, because countries rarely operate in simple ways, and by observing how BRICS members coordinate trade, resources, and policy while still pursuing individual goals, learners can understand that international relations involve balance, negotiation, and shared responsibilities rather than one-dimensional conflict.
For vocabulary practice, try creating your own sentences using today's key words. For example, Brazil and India are emerging markets that participate in BRICS, or power balance is important for maintaining stability in the global system. Using words actively will help reinforce meaning and improve your confidence when discussing international topics in English.
Finally, it is important to remember that learning English through global topics allows you to improve both language skills and world knowledge at the same time, because listening to international news, understanding global trends, and practicing vocabulary and context strengthens comprehension, reading, and speaking abilities, giving learners a practical and enjoyable way to grow.
We want to leave you with a calm, encouraging message. Take your time, listen carefully, and practice regularly. Because learning English is a journey, and exploring topics like BRICS, global trade, and international cooperation not only makes you more knowledgeable, but also makes your English stronger, clearer, and more confident each day.
Thank you for joining us today on the English Globe. Remember that every episode is an opportunity to improve your English, expand your understanding of the world, and connect new words and ideas in ways that are meaningful and memorable.
Keep practicing, stay curious, and enjoy learning English through interesting global topics. With patience, consistency, and curiosity, every listener can make steady progress, and we look forward to exploring more international ideas with you in the next episode.